This is Christine Clapp. I'm the founder of Spoken with Authority. I'm joined today by several of my fellow presentation skills experts, and we are focusing on how to make the transition back to in-person communication. What are things that we can think about, bad habits we can get out of the practice of, and just to make sure that as we go to in-person and hybrid events, that we are being effective speakers, whether we're in conversation, whether we're in meetings, or whether we're in a situation that is one-to-many, a public speech. Lisa, tell us what your best recommendations are.
The thing that's really on my mind right now is how we gather, and that we'll all be our best speakers and be at our best and be able to bring what we want to bring to any kind of speaking situation if there's a level of comfort of how we're together and how safe we feel about being in that in-person space. So to me, the keys to that are communication and real sensitivity. So communicating about what the criteria are for meeting in person, not just out in the world, but for this group of people, what have we agreed on about being together? And then that we're really sensitive. I always tend to think of being sensitive to the most vulnerable person in the room, or the person in the room who feels a need to be the most conservative. And so that we're not almost ostracizing the person who needs to be the most careful, or who's least comfortable being in that space or taking a mask off. So to me, it's about communication and sensitivity to people's needs, so that once we get into the space, everybody's able to be fully present in the space and ready to communicate at their best.
Absolutely. And as part of that sensitivity, I think it's important to note that not everyone is going to get the vaccine, and many people have very legitimate reasons for that, and to not be judgmental or to bring it up in workplace settings where it would give people a sense that they're not included in the workplace because they have made that choice for their own reasoning. So it's just something to keep in mind as we are approaching our conversations and our in-person experiences. Christina, tell us about your recommendations for making the transition to in-person communication after more than a year of virtual communication for many people in workplace settings.
Absolutely. And it's an interesting one for a lot of people. But one of the things that really stand out to me is the quality and the effect of sound and projection when you're speaking. So, of course, the pandemic brought a lot of challenges where that was concerned. We were wearing masks when speaking into mics. We were wearing masks in in-person scenarios as well. And then, of course, for the virtual settings, a lot of people were competing with environmental sounds and noises, maybe shouting into an echoey environment over the microphone. So one of the things that I really recommend is just the importance of remembering that the quality of sound is important both on the virtual setting as well as in person, especially if there's any obstruction. So if you do have to wear a mask, certainly you want to emphasize being able to speak and project clearly. And one of the things that I like here at Spoken with Authority is that we actually, Christine, you touched on this before, we have decibel recommendations for both indoor and outdoor speaking. And a lot of people don't realize this, but your audio, and we talk about this again here all the time, but your audio really captures the attention almost as importantly as the content, and sometimes, believe it or not, even more so. So I think my biggest tip is to understand your power in projection and in sound quality, and just do all that you can. We've talked about different mic options, if it's a virtual setting, or at the very least, if you don't have it in your budget, using the earbuds that plug directly into the device versus a wireless mic. Or wireless buds. And of course, if you are using a wireless mic, you want to make sure it's as close as possible. So if there is any latency, the sound quality will make up for those delays if there are any. But then, of course, just remembering that as we do venture out slowly and safely back into in-person events, it's just as important to have that volume appropriateness there in all of your speaking and projection. So that's one of my biggest tips.
Thanks, Christina. And one of the things that we use with so many of our clients is a decibel reader. So you can download an app on your phone. There are free ones to get a sense of how loud your voice is. And a lot of the free ones will show you the range of decibels and give you a sense of if it's where you're speaking is at a whisper or at a soft talk or at a shout. So you have a sense of where to go. And our colleague Michelle has said that a mask takes off about 3 to 12 decibels. So as you're gauging how loud you are, to think about that. The other thing is, as we're going back in person, we should be using microphones anyway for inclusion of people who are hard of hearing. So to just ask more IT professionals, AV professionals, can we use microphones in this meeting or this situation so it's easier for everyone because we're used to being on microphones from the virtual environment. Let's just take that into the in-person environment whenever it's appropriate or reasonable, practical to do so. All right, Jean Miller, what are your recommendations?
Well, I think there are things we have learned to do and learned to not do in the virtual environment. And some of those need to stay in person and some things we need to shift for in person. So I think one thing we've learned to do is make eye contact. We've learned the value of looking into the camera to give that illusion of eye contact in the virtual world. But we've also seen how tempting it is. We want to look at the screen like I'm doing now. We want to look at the faces, and that feedback is important. So in the in-person environment, I think we need to pay attention to that eye contact factor. And then one thing we've learned not to do in the virtual environment is move. We've all become very still to stay in our little box, and you know, people, the movement looks really distracting when we're in this little box. But in person, it's not natural to be like a statue. We want to have stillness in general for poise, but we want to be able to make gestures and focus on different parts of the room. And if we're not stuck with a lectern, we want to be able to move around to different parts of our audience. So I think that we need to focus on maintaining what we've learned about eye contact, but learning how to move again in the in-person environment.
Thank you, Jean. And one of the things I would say to piggyback on that is for speakers in a hybrid environment where some people are online and some people are in person, in terms of eye contact, you do need to look at people in the room, in the eyes, like you would in an in-person meeting before the pandemic. But you also need to look at the video, the camera for the people who are still online. So they have the experience of receiving eye contact from you. So that green dot is like one of the people in your audience. And you do have to look at it. You do have to speak into it so they feel like they're not just watching a meeting or an event, but they're having an experience of being included. So do take a look at that camera among other people in the room with you. And I had another idea on hybrid events. Jean, what was the second area that you talked about?
Was about our stillness online
yes.
and moving in person.
Thank you for reminding me. It's important when you're in hybrid events to ask the AV professionals, what is this speaking space in which I can move and the people online can still see me? Because sometimes we see speakers walking out of the camera, or you see teachers do it in classrooms that are hybrid, and the people online are looking at a screen that has no speaker in it. So it is important to ask and to practice what is the speaking area, to negotiate that ahead of time with the AV professionals, and even putting a piece of tape on the ground so you know where you can go and still be seen by the online participants, and where you can still move around and have that really authentic, interesting movement that we should go back to in person events. A couple of things that I would add is in terms of one of the habits that we've seen in terms of our clients in coaching sessions and in webinars is that the longer the pandemic goes on, the shorter amount of time people take before they join a meeting on Zoom. A year ago, people might join 5 or 10 minutes early for a meeting or an event, just like we would in person. And now it's seconds ahead of time. We really do need to get into the habit of coming a few minutes early. And I encourage you to do it if you're still online in an event or at a hybrid event and you're online, because that networking, that having conversation is important to building rapport in meetings and persuasive pitches and other situations, networking at conferences. So you get more out of it if you're able to come a few minutes early. Another thing to think about, like Lisa said, is just communicating your thoughts about in-person communication and what feels comfortable to you. I know for one, I am not excited to go back to doing handshakes because I do think it is a vector for illness. And I love meeting people, I love greeting them, but I would encourage people to say, you know, I'm comfortable with doing namaste and greeting in that way, or letting people know if you are not comfortable hugging, and just being overt about it so you can prevent some of those awkward moments when we transition back to in-person communication. And some people may assume, hey, we're back to meetings, so we're going to go back to hugging and handshaking. I don't think everyone is ready for that now and maybe ever again. The other thing to remember is that a lot of us have really gotten rusty with small talk. We've had fewer social interactions at work and in our personal lives. And I know that those are coming back, but we do have to think about it. And in the last year, the small talk has been very limited in my experience. It's all about, is everyone in your family okay? And have you had your vaccine or not? And again, we already talked about not bringing up that vaccine issue at work because it can make people uncomfortable, and thinking about how can I bring in interesting things to talk about? How can I practice those social skills of having a conversation with people, whether it's our neighbors or whether it's our coworkers, and just getting into the habit of doing it and trying to come up with interesting and appropriate things to talk about in those day-to-day interactions where we make relationships. So I want to thank everyone who was here today. We had Lisa and Christina and Jean for talking about what we can do now in May 2021 as we are thinking of transitioning back to doing more in-person and hybrid communication.